Good morning. This is
Good morning.
the AM Pacific, Bridges of Meaning, question and answer, conversation. If I can get these guys to talk.
What up? What up?
Let's see.
What up?
That's-
What up?
Hello, hello.
they're all wise asses.
Oh,
Well, is this kind of like a do you kind of want it to be sort of a free for all, like how we do in Discord, or do you want it to be more orderly, like taking turns sort of thing?
That's a good
'Cause I do
question.
notice people are very quiet.
Yeah, when I do my Thief in the Night live streams, we're much more you're much more active and the cameras are on and all that. The problem is that if we get too many people in this room, then we can't have the cameras on and it makes it a little more difficult. So I think it is better taking turns, but at least for the Friday question and answer. So thanks for asking. That's a good clarification. All right, I'm going to pick up last week IRL politique. Had a super chat question which I didn't get to, so I put it right there on the top. He asks, if you were invited, he or she, I don't know, I hate to misgender you, IRL politique. If you were invited to an ecumenical potluck gathering, what would you bring? And who would you be most interested in talking to? Because I don't have a lot of culinary skills, I would probably swing through KFC and bring a bucket of chicken, because in my opinion, the best potlucks have lots of fried chicken. So that's definitely what I'd bring. Who would I be interested in talking to? Well, that varies so much depending on, there's a lot of issues with that. People often want to talk to high status people. People sometimes want to talk to people who are similar to themselves because they're easier to talk to. Sometimes people want to talk to people who are different from themselves. Who would I like to talk to? That really depends, because in any gathering, you look around the room and there's lots of different filters that sort of manifest themselves. So I will be going to an ecumenical gathering. Part of the thing is I'm just so high in openness. I like talking to lots of different people and I like asking questions. And so I would probably do at that gathering pretty similar to what I do at the Discord and on my channel. And I just like finding different people and asking them questions. One of the things as a pastor that I've learned is I often ask questions about how they spend their time. And that might be their day job. It might be caring for a child. It might be caring for a loved one. It might be a hobby. And when you get people talking about something that they really care about, you can learn a lot because they speak with passion and conviction. And those are fun conversations. So it's probably what I do. PK Josh, as a Calvinist, how do you view the Great Commission at the end of Matthew 28? Coming from an evangelical background, this was taught as the Christian's purpose in life. What part does this play in solving the meaning crisis? Well, in Matthew, first things are important, last things are important. And the call of Matthew 28 is basically a call of what we might call disciple making. The main verbs, baptizing, teaching, these are pretty standard Jewish practices in terms of disciple making. And that's in fact what Jesus spent his 3 years of public ministry doing. He spent his 3 years making disciples of those people that he gathered around. Kale Zeldin on Twitter this morning asked me about Charles Taylor's Tier 1, Tier 2, and we were talking about that. Hierarchies develop of disciples, and that's not in and of itself a bad thing. So as a Calvinist, now this Calvinist word is tricky, and I last week did a thing last Monday on a channel, Break the Rules, where I talked to, there was a guy who was a Gnostic, and there's a guy who, I forget what the host is into. And then there's another guy who's Roman Catholic. And I talked to a guy who was a formerly Young, Restless, and Reformed Calvinist. This, early in the 20th century, if you would have asked someone in the Christian Reformed Church what the biggest threats were that they faced in this new land of America, they probably would have been Catholics and Methodists. And elements of evangelicalism that are quite pervasively embraced by some conservatives in the Christian Reformed Church would have been seen as anathema and very much associated with Methodism. Now, those old church fights were back there for a reason, but they have sort of gone away today. In the Christian Reformed Church, many of the confessionalists are, well, this isn't entirely true. The inroads of the Young, Restless, and Reformed movement have made their way into the Christian Reformed Church to some degree, but I am old enough to remember, for example, Roger Greenway. Roger Greenway is the father of Scott Greenway. Scott Greenway is a pastor in the Grand Rapids area. I was a classmate of Scott's at seminary. Scott Greenway is another third-generation Christian Reformed minister. His father, Roger Greenway, taught at Westminster Seminary and also taught at Calvin Seminary. His father and his mother, Roger Greenway's wife, was Edna. They were foreign missionaries. She taught Spanish actually at the college when I was there. And Roger Greenway's father, when Roger Greenway announced that he was going to be a foreign missionary, said something to the effect, I got this story from Scott, why would you go and do that? If God wants to make Christians, he doesn't need you. So that idea has very much been in our tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that Scott Greenway's grandfather didn't believe in the Great Commission. He just sort of went about it differently, because Christian Reformed churches in the beginning and middle of the 20th century, even if they were nervous about Methodism, as it was called, were, understood disciple making, because everything that was going on in the Christian Reformed Church was about disciple making. Even the Protestant Reformed Church that split off from the Christian Reformed Church over the question of common grace understood disciple making. So evangelicals tend to emphasize evangelism, and that's tends to be flipping a category, turning people from those who don't identify as Christian, but very quickly, once they start identifying as Christian, evangelicals then sort of switch into disciple-making mode. And that's what Matthew 28 is. What does this have to do with the meaning crisis? Well, it certainly affords Christians meaning, that this is your great calling to make disciples, and that's very strong in evangelicalism. Now, in fairness to evangelicals, lots and lots and lots of people want to make disciples. It's very human to want to make disciples. In many ways, people are naturally evangelistic in that if they find a good thing, they want to share it with others. Have you met anybody that's into essential oils? Have you met anybody that's into Amway? Has anybody ever offered you a book recommendation or a movie recommendation? It's really natural, there's that word, for human beings to want to share a good thing. It's just part of kindness. So if, in fact, a group of people find that following Jesus and being Jesus' disciple brings them life, what do I mean by that? Makes them happier, gives them a sense of meaning, helps them to have purpose in life, helps orient and direct all sorts of aspects of their lives, reduces a whole bunch of negative things in their lives, they're going to want to share that. So it's a pretty natural thing. And it's not just centered around Matthew 28. I think in some ways people will find verses in the Bible that tend to articulate what they're experiencing and feeling. In many ways, that's similar to a lot of people who got excited about Jordan Peterson because he seemed to be saying what they were thinking in a better way than they could say it. I heard many people tell me that often. And so it's not uncommon for people to open a Bible and read something and think, yeah, that's it right there. And then once they got that idea that that's it right there, then they want to share it. So my friend Phil shows up on the Freddie and Paul show fairly often. He once saw this reverse. He saw this reverse lettered thing with Jesus. There it is. Oh, there it is here. And so he just makes these little Jesus signs all over the place. And that's him right there. He's got a shirt that says Jesus Man, and he's a Giants fan. And he makes these little signs all over the place, these little Jesus signs. And that's been for him an important part of his life. I got to know him because I got to know his son. And then his wife died, leaving him a widower. And he needed purpose in life. And so he had done a little bit of that before, but once his wife died, he went into sign making overdrive, and he's got them on magnets, and he's got them on business cards, and he carves them in wood, and he will mow them into your lawn or your wheat or your cornfield. He will paint it on the side of your bus. He'll make a giant sign. He goes all over the place making his Jesus signs. And so then he takes pictures of the people that he gives the signs to and gets their stories. And yeah, and that's what Philip the Jesus Man does. And he thinks the Jesus sign is cool, and it gives him a chance to meet people and get to know people. And so that's his ministry. I don't know how he would have gotten through the death of his wife without that. And so, yeah, when his wife died, it's very interesting. I was just thinking about this because I mentioned again, there's an older gentleman met the other day who just recently lost his wife. I hadn't seen him since the last time I saw him was a few years ago when he and his wife visited the church, and then he came without her. And boy, I'll tell you, it sure seems like widowers miss their wives a lot more than widows miss their husbands. Just saying. Seems true. So many of the widowers I know, you ask them about their wives, they choke up, they tear up, they just miss their wives. But a lot of widows, I'm not saying they don't miss their husbands or they don't tear up or choke up, but they just seem to do a lot better. Am I right, Rick? Rick says I'm right. All right, I must be right. Okay. That question was seconded. Beta Rampage. Well, how do hypothetical we are going with this? Would they have to be alive? I'd like to pick Dietrich Bonhoeffer's brain a bit. Yeah, radical ecumenical potlucks. And again, ecumenical sort of means different areas within the divided Church of Jesus Christ. So, but I'll talk to just about anybody, even people I've named on my show. I'd like to pick their brains. I'd like to understand how they think. This morning I was watching a video on it was quite interesting because I followed Tim Keller quite closely not too long ago. The video was, I'm just pulling up the title here. Come on, you can do it. Oh, come on. This makes for terribly boring questions and answers. What happened to Tim Keller on Conversations That Matter? Which kind of goes through the story of Tim Keller. It's very interesting. Like I've been if I do a video this afternoon, it might be sort of a compare and contrast between Sky Jatani and Doug Wilson. But you start watching a video, you start like diving into someone on YouTube, and of course YouTube starts to feed you up a bunch of other channels that people who've been watching this one channel watch too, and so you really kind of get an idea of the egregore or the zeitgeist or what have you. So, you know, I was watching this thing about Tim Keller, and Tim Keller is someone whose ministry I know fairly well. And so just watching it and just thinking about the nuance and the trigger words and all the different ways we sort of propagandize each other. But I like to, quite frankly, I like to talk to my enemies, because you know what? You can learn from them. That's a good Peterson rule. You know, talk to someone as if as if they have something to teach you. Because if you go to them with that posture, they likely will teach you something. So, yeah. I like the Herman Munster picture in your thing too there, Beta Rampage. That's pretty cool. All right, Oscar. Well, this is a surprise. I'm surprised Joey didn't cut down this question because it's a long one. But here we go. It seems to me that a lot of Christians do their best at trying to downplay just how radical and offensive Jesus really is to the natural understanding. All right, put that in scare quotes, but I agree with that. I think and this is a point that I try to make often, they killed Jesus for a reason. And this is another thing that I've said a lot. Both sides in a bloody and vicious culture war, who could agree on very little, could both agree that they wanted Jesus dead. Anyone who has any understanding of the culture and the time in which Jesus lived and works should have a good understanding of the fact that it's amazing Jesus lasted 3 years. Because a lot of the things that the Gospels have recorded that Jesus said would get you dead fast in that place and time. And even today. And this is part of so you have that's, I think, just true. And so part of what happens over time, and when you begin worshiping someone as Lord, is you tend to take the edges off. Jesus was he used hyperbole. Jesus was so annoying, disruptive, and offensive that his annoyance, his disruption, and his offense continues today. And it's rather interesting watching people who are to a degree emerging from conservative Christianity take offense at Jesus. So I had on my channel John Sook, who used to be banner editor, which is a really big deal in my denomination. He left the denomination and went to a liberal Church of Canada church in Toronto. And he now sort of identifies as a weak theist, which means kind of maybe there's a God, but he's the minister of a what would be a mainline church in Toronto that spends their time doing good in the neighborhood and, you know, speaking up for all of the progressive causes, et cetera, et cetera. And so every now and then I go back to his blog and I read some of his sermons, and I remember his sermon on the Syrophoenician woman. And he basically, he didn't quite dare to say that Jesus was misogynist or racist for the way he treated the Syrophoenician woman, but you could tell part of him kind of wanted to. Well, there you go. Radical and offensive. And Jesus, in many ways, is sort of an equal opportunity offender. You know, that piece, What Happened to Tim Keller, it's so funny because as this person is going through all of the forming influences of Tim Keller, so many of those forming influences are in me just 10 years later. And that was that kind of ministry to the poor, conservative Dutch Reformed, city evangelism. That was what I was raised in. So yeah, there's lots of stumbling blocks to go around when it comes to Jesus. So yeah, I think your first point is right. Jesus is not an archetype, as Peterson says. That's right, because he has skin and bones on him. An archetype by nature is immaterial. He's archetypal, but he is not merely an archetype. Or maybe he's the quintessential archetype. This is where words are tricky. And he is not the big symbolic pattern like Peugeot seems to suggest. And again, does he embody symbolic patterns? Absolutely. Is he merely a symbolic pattern? No. So we want to be a little careful with language, I think. Jesus is painfully idiosyncratic. And it often seems that St. Paul and not many others really understood this fully. Well, that's interesting. Oscar is not in the room. This will be interesting. Cursing the fig tree and riding on a donkey, for example, are not something the archetypal hero or the universal Stoic logos can easily be said to do. Even orthodox typology must often be stretched to implausible lengths to keep some of the Old Testament relevant for Christianity. Christ is the Word of God, yes, but in a sense that is radically different from any other such logos or pattern that human reason or biology might produce. Ooh, this is getting radical. I almost feel like I'm reading Karl Barth when I'm reading this question. Christ opens up, I say that, so I'm in Romans, and Job, before he was on his 90-day exodus, asked me if I had read Karl Barth's commentary on the book of Romans, and I had not. So I grabbed a used copy, and I've read some of it, and I hadn't read a lot of Barth before, but Barth's interesting, but he's sort of esoteric. Anyway. Christ opens up a path beyond the fallen and closed loop of nature, and is thus not reducible to patterns of history, mythological logic, or fallen reason, but a new logos altogether. Now, I might say that, in fact, pulling the book of Colossians, that creation itself comes from him, and because there's both fallenness in us and a curse upon creation, that you can only get so far in knowing Christ through creation. I think that's kind of what you're trying to say here, if I'm understanding you correctly. Attempts to reduce Christ are often done to perpetuate the status quo, like maintaining ontological hierarchies between persons or oppressive and tyrannical relations between man and God, utterly alien and antithetical to Christ and St. Paul. Interesting. Christ, for Peugeot and Peterson, merely confirm their existing psychological or symbolic worldviews and is not the foundation for either. Peugeot's brother's book doesn't mention or require Christ, and Christ justifies the Holy West for Peterson. How do you see Peterson's and Peugeot's Christology in contrast to your own? Wow, what a question. Rick's got Harley Davidson on my mind. Now Rick hides his head in shame. He's been playing South Park to me again. Rick is a very bad influence on me. I like where you went with your question. I think Peugeot could answer for himself what he sees. So on one hand, so now I'm a Calvinist. So I have a fairly high accounting of brokenness in terms of our capacity to reverse engineer creation and have a faithful vision of Christ. And now, of course, my tradition would say I get my Calvinism from St. Paul via Augustine. Okay. So one of the interesting things in looking at responses to Peugeot have been the responses from, let's say, Nate Heil, representing Christian anarchism, which is something I never knew existed, or let's say Julian the Hutterite, Anabaptism. Now, Peugeot's own story runs through Anabaptism. Remember that he served with Mennonite Central Committee in the Congo, and even recently when he talked about relief for Ukrainian refugees, he recommended Mennonite Central Committee. So there's some critique of Peugeot out there, which is fine. I think, again, I'm a Calvinist, and part of what that means is none of us gets this right. We're all subject to critique. And I think if one is able to listen to their critics, they can sometimes benefit from it. I would have to say that my Christology is, I don't know how developed it is. I don't know that I've spent a lot of time thinking about Christology as such. But I think the book of Colossians is pretty critical to trying to understand the relationship between, let's say, general revelation and Christology. Peterson, of course, is not, how to describe Peterson's relationship with Christianity. It's really difficult to describe Peterson's relationship with Christianity because he's sort of playing the modernist public-private thing. I suspect Peterson in private would speak more freely about understanding Christ as logos and archetypal man. Obvious from Peugeot and Peterson's conversation that the enfleshment, the story verse and the physical world touching each other is something that Peterson wrestles with. For Peugeot and I, part of what public Christian profession means is that we can, in some ways, be a little bit more bold of making declarations like that. And part of the reason we can do that is because we can make the declaration and then take a step back and let creeds and confessions and church fathers and theologians and the church continue to defend us. In other words, we don't have to produce the whole thing. Part of the negative implication of Peterson standing outside the church means that he can't just say, Jesus is Lord, I'm a Christian that stands with the Apostles, Nicene, Athanasian Creed, in my case, the Belgic Confession, and leave it at that, and then have people take pot shots at the Nicene Creed or the Athanasian Creed or the Belgic Confession. So it's like, okay, well, attack those things and I can sort of, I don't have the need to utterly defend those things, because there's an entire community that has been working those conversations for a very long time. So I don't really know. So it's easier to look at the difference between Peterson's Christology and mine, because he does not submit to a church tradition formally, publicly. Peugeot and I do. Peugeot's Christology and mine, that's harder to say. I've obviously listened to a fair amount of Peugeot, and some of the most interesting to me conversations that Peugeot has is when he's trying to explain his view of Christianity to Christianity's critics and skeptics. But Peugeot, like me, because he has placed himself under the authority and within the tradition of the church, can sort of take a step back and say, okay, I subscribe to these creeds and confessions, or I follow these people. And it's sort of like in this sense, Peterson is standing outside on his own, and is vulnerable, and in some ways responsible for trying to figure out all of these things. That's the negative condition of not submitting and joining a tradition and a church. Peugeot and I, we, in a sense, live within walls, and the walls are the traditions of our church, and the walls are successive walls. And so there's sort of the big walls of the creeds that both of us subscribe to, and then there are other segments within those walls. There might be slight differences, and then there would be our idiosyncratic differences. But I don't know that I have either mapped out my own Christology sufficiently, nor heard enough from Peugeot, nor to really, let's say, explore the difference between ours. Peterson is different because Peterson has not taken up residence within the walls. And once you take up residence within the walls, you can use those walls to basically show where you are and show where others are. Those walls afford a mapping of some of the positions. And then there's also the fact that, one of the questions on the videos today was, what are upper and lower register? My upper and lower register are sort of God 1 and God 2, in that this is a framework that I continue to use to try to map out and tease out differences in the conversations that we're hearing. So Paul's position on Christology, stated like that: static, eternal, timeless, non-chronological, is very upper register. It was quite interesting having the YouTube algorithm feed up a video I didn't recognize. It was from the Jonathan Peugeot Clips channel, and it was about prayer. And Peugeot talks to Paul, and I thought, wonder what Paul he was talking to. So I clicked on the video, and that Paul was me. And it was from our conversation in 2018 about angels and demons and the city of God. And so I watched a little bit of that video, and it's a little weird watching me from 4 years ago and thinking about, I remember me from 4 years ago. A lot of you remember me from 4 years ago. But what I have is this two-dimensional avatar of me 4 years ago engaging with Jonathan Peugeot, and Peugeot himself didn't have any gray in his beard, and he's looking all young and vigorous, and just thinking, okay, how have I changed? And you bump into this often when you talk to people who know a fair amount about Augustine, and they'll talk about Augustine before his tussle with Pelagius and Augustine after his tussle with Pelagius. I think that there are many people in the Christian Reformed Church that think about PVK before YouTube or before Jordan Peterson, and PVK after Jordan Peterson and Peugeot. And maybe someday people will say PVK before Rick or PVK after Rick. Who knows? We're like that. And that's all lower register going through time. Upper register is very static. And so I doubt I will ever have a degree of significance to match, definitely not Augustine, but even many public famous people, where much of anyone will pay much attention to me or my journey before or after certain things in my life. But this is where we get into all these naughty upper register questions about what does Paul believe as opposed to Jonathan Peugeot? We have both of us an upper register thing, as if Jonathan Peugeot and I are fixed. This is part of where death is convenient, because at least I, in the sense of this physical flesh and blood being, stop participating in the world. Yet when it comes to history, look at so part of what was going on in that Tim Keller sermon that I was watching this morning was every chance they'd get, they'd want to show how Tim Keller was, agreeing with Marx. Okay, so who is Karl Marx? Was Marx a Marxist? Well, that depends on what Marxism you're talking about. And, a famous example of this is Karl Mueller's fine essay, Was Calvin a Calvinist? Because which Calvin? So one of the things about John Calvin is that his most famous book, The Institutes of the Christian Religion, is kind of like a blog, in that he wrote one edition, and then there's another edition, and there's another edition, and there's another edition. And throughout his life, the book just kept growing. And it was a very popular and formative book for the Europe of his day. And so, but you would probably find different John Calvins in there. So in other words, figuring out and assessing John Calvin in terms of sort of an eternal John Calvin, how does that eternal John Calvin relate to the John Calvin going through time? How does the eternal PVK relate to the Paul Vanderklay going through time? The Paul Vanderklay who, when he was at Calvin Seminary, had classmates say, yeah, I was talking to the board of trustees, and they're a little worried that you're, basically they're worried that you're Marxist. It was hilarious when, although I didn't laugh at the moment, it was hilarious when Tripp, tried to explain me to his wife's uncle. Well, Paul's basically a communist. And I thought, I'm a communist? I'm a strange kind of communist if I am one. But, I've had all these iterations. Tim Keller once made the comment about book writing that he said he waited until his 50s to start really writing books. And he said, anything I would have written in my 20s, I'd want to burn. Anything that I'd written in my 30s and 40s would have been, in some ways, unripe. So now in your 50s, it's a good time to start writing, because you're sort of getting closer probably to what's going to be for each of us sort of more of our upper register state. So, I've been having conversations and watching John Vervaeke for the past 4 years. Is there movement in Vervaeke over this time? Most definitely. Are we happy for that? I think so. When we move, do we think it's an improvement? Usually. So this is all part of this. So it's a good question about Christology. And I like when I read your long preamble to your short question, I again hear within you some of what I hear in Karl Barth. And that is right, because that is good Christology, in that God is always above us and beyond us, and we can never fully bring God down to earth and reduce him to fit within our little noggins. Yet there is always, in relating, you can't relate to something that you haven't, to one degree or another, created a mapping for. So even, I've gotten to know Rick over the last few years. There's a map in my head of Rick, and the real Rick is way more complex, way bigger, way more nuanced than the map in my head of Rick. Rick will tell me stories sometimes that'll surprise me. Rick will give me comments and opinions sometimes that will surprise me. So that's part of the way the world goes in terms of how we react to it. That was a long answer. I want to take a drink here. Anybody in the comment room want to weigh in on this or say something about it? I see Saint Manuel is in there. He usually has something to say.
Well, I do have something to say, but it's a little bit off topic. I saw your last live stream, and I was a little bit worried for all these Europeans getting their sleep schedule messed up because of you.
I'm hurting Europe.
Yeah, all these bright minds, they need their sleep.
Well, I don't know if that's a big pause or what, but guess I'll go on to the next question. Christian Golden, if we withhold love from ourselves, do we inherently then withhold love from God? See, what's interesting and what's really fun about having a little estuary where things slow down from the open internet is you get to know each other a little bit. And this isn't too far from the tree you were barking up for the last couple of weeks about this. You're really working on, what exactly does the Bible mean when we say we're in his image? And how does that image bearing scale and translate into these other loci of theology? What do I mean by loci of theology? Systematic theology. So you have all of this theology and it's just all out there. And in modernity, you want to systematize theology. And so you have these loci. That's where you kind of focus them. So you have Christology and theology and soteriology, doctrine of salvation, anthropology, doctrine of humanity, eschatology, doctrine of last things. So you have all of that stuff. And so you're really working on this question of image. And it isn't incidental that Jesus summarizes the law as loving the Lord your God and loving your neighbor as yourself, because that image is the image of God, is what connects love of God with love of each other. Yet, just because something has the image of another greater thing doesn't mean it needs to be treated as that other and greater thing. For example, I just talked about the fact that in my mind, I have a mapping of Rick. Okay. Let's say I was going to somehow draw out my mapping of Rick and somehow represent my mapping of Rick in some way. Maybe I could do it on a piece of paper. Maybe I'd make a little Rick doll. Maybe I'd make a little maybe make a little Rick plushie. Maybe I'd take something and modify it, put a little, I don't know, Rick, you can decide, Rick, what kind of plushie you want to be. So I would make an image of Rick. And getting back to Oscar's point, it would have to be a reduction of Rick. And so even though all of my neighbors are image bearers of God, God is always greater than even the sum of my neighbors. So this is where doing this kind of math gets a little tricky. And the language too is a little slippery. We withhold love from ourselves. All right, well, what do you mean by that? Insofar as you have not done for the least of these, what suggestions do you have for Christians who are reluctant to have love for themselves for fear of doing so in a way that is not nested within the love of God? I also, another one of, there's a lot of wisdom in Peterson's little rules. And one of his first 12 rules, care for yourself in the way that you would care for another that you're responsible for. And as a pastor, I know that's a good rule. So what often happens, again, I've got a fair amount of experience with seniors. What often happens, especially with couples as they get older, and husbands and wives both do this. Let's say someone comes down with Parkinson's or Alzheimer's. Now, Parkinson's and Alzheimer's are conditions of slow degeneration. And it's unlike cancer, and especially, let's say, heart failure, where there's sort of an acute and immediate crisis moment. Alzheimer's is a very long, slow degeneration. Parkinson's can be a very long, slow degeneration. And so as the one spouse continues to degenerate, the other spouse, who is probably just as old, if not older, and has their own health conditions, as the one degenerates, the other basically continues to rise to pick up the slack. And then what happens often is that the caretaker dies before the one they're caring for, because in their 70s or 80s or 90s, they can no longer compensate for the other. And all kinds of things factor into that. And so as a pastor, what I will often do, because if someone is, let's say, degenerating via Alzheimer's, it's much more difficult for me to do sense making with the person with Alzheimer's than sense making with the spouse who is caring for them, as I will continue to remind them, you need to take care of yourself. Because if you don't take care of yourself, the thing that you most want, which is to love your spouse, you will not be able to do, because you'll wind up in the hospital. And I've seen this often, that in fact the spouse who is trying to compensate for the degeneration and the loss of the other does wind up in the hospital. Then suddenly they're both a mess. And so this is where we need each other, and family has to step up, and people have to make accommodations for the loss of capacity, et cetera, et cetera. So you're right in terms of probing around this area. So again, I mentioned I was, I'm thinking about doing a video where I want to bring in both Sky Jatani in the video and also Doug Wilson, which should create quite a few sparks, especially the Doug Wilson video that I want to bring in. And So Doug Wilson also had a video that's out fairly soon, Apologies That Lie. And Wilson goes into a fairly nuanced treatment of relationships and of lying in marriage. The world is really complex. It is really complex. And figuring out what love requires. Now, the reason we use words in the way that we do, like love, is it sort of helps, again, upper and lower register. You use a word like love, it sort of helps to locate something in the upper register, because we sort of need fixed points by which we can navigate and make decisions by. And Christians have for a long time looked negatively on suicide. Well, why? Well, there's a lot of different reasons why. Life is a gift. It's not yours to, it belongs to God. It's not yours to trespass over. But also, suicide is a way of violating self-love. Now, the Bible doesn't talk a lot about self-love. Why not? Because culturally, that didn't make a lot of sense. So we also have the problem that we have this one English word, love, that you can read C.S. Lewis's Four Loves, where you have agape, phileo, eros, storge. Figuring out how to love your neighbor as yourself is no small thing. Knowing that you should care for yourself, body is the temple of the Holy Spirit, you can throw that verse at it, is an important thing. So at the same time, we have to, it's instinctive for us to put ourselves ahead of others. And there are moments when that is appropriate and moments when that is inappropriate. It's also, in some ways, instinctive for us to put ourselves at risk for the sake of others. Parents do that. Mothers do that. Every woman who brings a child into this world does so at the risk and sometimes at the cost of her life. That kind of relationship with one another, men do this when they go off to war. So, but yet we would tell a soldier, you have to value, if you don't value your safety and your health by caring for yourself physically, you will not be able to express the value and love you have for others with your strength and fitness. You could say it that way. In other words, that these loves are deeply connected and should be seen as such. And figuring out how to apply this in individual circumstances is very difficult. Let's say you're in a difficult marriage. Let's say you have children. How do you work through these priorities? Are your needs not important? Yeah, they are. Are your children's needs not important? Yeah, they are. Are your spouse's needs not important? Yeah, they are. How are you going to manage the agency and resources you have that maximizes and optimizes all of the needs that are in that economy? That's sort of the task. And it isn't easy. And you get a lot wrong. And hopefully after you get some things wrong, you go back and you try and do it better and you try and improve. So I don't know if that's helpful to you, Christian. You can answer if you want to. Maybe I took it in a way that you didn't intend.
Well, Paul, just to mention, I think it was a conversation with Tripp, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but there was a comment made in that video where the guy says, Tripp's friend, he says, but I want to be the hero for my family and for those around me, and something like that. He was talking about, his view of his spirituality and Christianity, and I don't know, it's just I think maybe that's another way to consider this, right? Is that when we think we need to be Jesus, right? To image Jesus means to be Jesus, or to be the hero, or to be the savior, even. I think that's a place I've seen people get in a lot of trouble with.
Yeah, they can. And yet sometimes when they do it well, it's inspiring and life-saving, family-saving, and saving for even broader groups. Yeah, you're right. And we talk about people with Messiah complexes, and it's tremendously difficult. No, you're right.
I think discerning what can I do in a situation, where can I be of service, where can I be of help, with what I've got to work with, right?
Yep.
Reasonably, yeah.
All right, Paul, is it too simple to say Christ is God in human form? Depends on what too simple for what. Figuring out how to talk about the Trinity has been a difficult thing for a very long time. So I don't think that's too simple. Are there limits to that articulation? There are limits to a bunch of the words, like what do you mean by form? And what do you mean by simple? So, OCD perfectionist nitpicker. Wow. Hi, Paul. Is God number one up there, out there, and God number two down in here? That wouldn't be my favorite formulation. But again, like I said before, there's sort of two boxes on my theological workbench. In some ways, God number two, this is, and Joseph, rightfully engaged in questions of immanence and transcendence. I think, my favorite right now is sort of arenic and agentic. God number one is arenic. God number two is agentic. That's my current status of God number one, God number two. So, Michael, many of the symbolic tools used in the historic cathedrals were designed to help communicate the gospel to illiterate people, such as statuary and iconography, symbolic architecture, and stained glass windows. Putting nostalgia aside, how is that different from building a replica of Noah's Ark in Kentucky? The reformers did not. The reformers were iconoclasts in many ways, and the difficulty with images is that they're so useful. We keep bringing them back. Yeah, you have to be honest with your own tradition. And, when Richard Rowland notes to Jonathan Peugeot that the Reformed Baptists that he was a part of had their own saints, had their own iconography, even if they were formally iconoclastic, he had a point. And, who was I talking to? We're talking about the Noah's Ark thing. Oh yeah, I was talking to, what's his head? right down the road. He was talking about my last Randall's conversation that I posted. Yeah. Why make that ark? And I heard someplace, are they going to build a Tower of Babel? It's like, that's just too delicious to think about. So yeah, it's a good point. Inconsistencies are abundant among human beings. All right. I do expect the church or Christendom to be more childish in their words, their thoughts, their behaviors, their attitudes. I do expect them to be more prone, more joyful to harmonize the world with the scriptures. I do expect the new converts to participate in this harlotry, some of their luggages of perversion, and I don't separate the liberals with the mainstream population. These latter ones are not out of aim. The worldly validation is so precious to all of them. The validation among men is what drive their actions. They want their capricious perversions to be validated, and it is granted because why not? They are not very good with this masquerade, but it works, and nobody but a few will notice this collective cuckoldry until they are finally lured and seduced to join their ranks. They will pray, your kingdom come, and then they will teach exactly that so that everyone is deceived. They will promote and defend the doctrines of the world. They will be indignant and outraged by what the world tells them to be. They are nice puppies indeed. When the sinful incentives are that strong, they stand as truth and sound doctrines in the ears of the adulteress who is considered faithful, and then in the ears of the next child to come, fed abundantly with unsound teaching. Just be real with that fall trajectory for once, Paul. What would Jeremiah do? What would Elisha do? Don't quite know how to answer that, but there you go. I don't even have a very clear picture of what you're trying to say. You're in the chat room. I don't know if maybe you can elucidate and contextualize it a little bit more for me, because it's sort of abstract. All right, maybe you can't come to the computer right now. Okay, how might Christian teachers expound the glory of the incarnation and resurrection, and therefore the goodness of the physical world, in ways which actually might be intelligible to an increasingly disincarnate digital age? So, like I said, one of the videos that if I have time this afternoon, I might make will be a little bit of, let's put Skye Jitani and Doug Wilson next to each other. Why those two? Well, Skye Jitani has a large enough footprint in evangelicalism. He was a former editor at Christianity Today. He's sort of a celebrity evangelical in that he is a pastor, but doesn't really pastor a church. He has a podcast and a bunch of other things. And he's just kind of out there having a career of giving Christian teaching on the internet and through books and at conferences, et cetera, et cetera. Doug Wilson is sort of a big wig in a little town in Idaho, Moscow, Idaho. And some people consider Doug Wilson's church kind of a cult. Wilson's an interesting guy. I've listened to a bunch of his videos now. If you go way back, if you search on YouTube for Doug Wilson and Christopher Hitchens, those two became friends, and they had quite a few interesting conversations. And they're an interesting pair. because Doug Wilson is pretty conservative and in sort of the Reformed persuasion of things. I don't know that much about him. I've listened to maybe a few hours of his videos, but I know a lot of people expect that I would leave my church because why would I spend time with dozens of people on the ground on a little corner in Sacramento rather than pursuing a career publishing, speaking, video making, podcast making, just kind of out there on the open internet and on the open evangelical circuit, et cetera, et cetera. There's a degree of respect I have for someone like Doug Wilson because he stays local. That isn't a small thing, because in some ways, even though you can speak to thousands of people fairly easily through YouTube or podcasts or through print media, it's a different thing having a community and a small community of real life people around you. Mega churches in some ways have some of the same issues as, let's say, a media ministry. We can call it that. I think in many ways, the glory of the incarnation and resurrection are best revealed with as many layers of reality engaged as possible. It's relatively easy to talk good, to say nice words. It's a lot harder to deal with living, breathing human beings in all of their complexity, with all of their traumas. And so the test of all of this media ministry is its effectiveness in shaping flesh and blood people in real time in the lower register. And media ministry is all just sort of up here. So I've got now thousands, hundreds or thousands of hours of me on podcast or video of disembodied me talking and making noise. And this is multiplied through the miracles of digital technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there's an infertility to that if it doesn't manifest itself in flesh and blood. So that's the disincarnate digital age is powerful. It's in some ways very upper register, but reality is where the upper and lower registers meet. And that's what people are. We are the breath of God and the stuff of earth. Love, the book of James talks about this. So, yeah. And so we struggle with that. Andromeda. Since today is the feast of the Annunciation and Consecration Day, finally, can you briefly explain the relationship your denomination has with the Blessed Virgin Mary? Do you agree with this take or not? My denomination and the Virgin Mary. Christian Reformed Church is pretty Protestant in that Mary was a Mary was used by God to bring Christ into the world. Mary doesn't function much in the Christian Reformed Church theologically. We had, gosh, how often would even her name have been brought up in my theological education? Hardly at all. Scott McKnight, not too many years ago, wrote a good book on Mary, basically trying to get at the Protestant, expand Protestant appreciation for Mary. In listening to Catholics and Orthodox talk about Mary, it's been interesting, and in some ways I see it very much in the same, my understanding of it has increased as my understanding of what Richard Rowland and Jonathan Peugeot talk about when they talk about universal history. Protestantism started and in some ways remains deeply committed to the lower register. I didn't finish the book, and I'd still like to finish it. This fascinating book on Vatican I, Ultramontanism. I didn't really understand what that meant before. It's very interesting how late a lot of theology, Roman Catholic theology about Mary is. And I think part of that has to do with the Roman Catholic Church wrestling with modernism. So basically, the Christian Reformed Church does not celebrate the Feast of the Annunciation at all. We don't. It's not in our calendar. It's not going to show up on the liturgy. I think part of the diminishment of the conflict between Protestants and Catholics has been the opening for a greater appreciation of Mary among Protestants, because Roman Catholic veneration of Mary became a pretty contentious point between Protestants and Catholics. But it's not to the point where Mary shows up as holidays within Protestant churches. So that would be an attempt to explain. Do you agree with this take or not? I think I have I'd say not only a greater understanding, but a greater appreciation of the part that Mary plays in Orthodox and Catholic communities today. And I think Protestants can learn something from this. But apart from reading your question, I had no idea that today was the Feast of the Annunciation. That just shows how Protestant I am. To me, I mean, it's the fact that I would say a majority of Christian Reformed churches now observe to one degree or another or recognize Lent and Advent. That's a sea change in the denomination. And that, when I was growing up, we never had Lent in at Northside Chapel in Patterson? Never. When I was going to Madison Square Church in Grand Rapids, I think they had an Ash Wednesday service. That was radical. That was the 1980s in Grand Rapids. But you see, it's helpful to remember that, well, the 1980s followed the 1970s, and the 1970s was a time of a lot of reassessing. And so part of what's been happening in Protestant churches in America, I've spoken before about the fact that the Christian Reformed Church is in this Christian Reformed identity as a Dutch immigrant church has continued to recede as generations of Dutch immigrants slowly become American and Canadian. In that process, the major divisions in the American Protestant church between the main line and the evangelical, those forces continue to pull at the Christian Reformed Church. Because of the conservatism of the denomination, most sort of wind up on the evangelical side of things, but mainline influence from, let's say, Episcopalians came in sort of liturgically, because while on one hand, the majority of the denomination would be paying attention to culture war issues and tending to line up with the evangelicals, liturgically, a lot of the influence of the denomination came through something like the Calvin Center for Christian Worship, which is a very ecumenical ministry at Calvin, and a periodical that the Christian Reformed Church had, Reformed Worship, which tended to bring in high church, often Anglican and Episcopalian liturgies and ideas, and I'll say energy into the denomination. Now, that has gotten interesting because, for example, when Kevin Adams, I hope to have Kevin on the channel because he just wrote a book about baptism. When Kevin Adams, my friend and colleague from up in Rockland, Lincoln, planted his church in the early 1990s, he basically used Willow Creek seeker methodology to plant his church. The second church we planted, River Rock Church in Folsom, used cell group house church methodology to plant their church with a fair amount of seeker stuff. Subsequent, one of the last churches that we've planted, Christ Church Davis, very much Anglican infused. Eric Dirksen, the pastor of it, who's been on the channel, is currently working on a PhD in the UK and is posting pictures of planted River Rock Church in Folsom, used cell group house. It's me again. Rickle, get on top of it. Thanks, Rick. He's just fawning all over these amazing buildings and church buildings and cathedrals in the UK right now. Their church has weekly communion. They're far more liturgical, far more sacramental. And so you see those changes coming through. Mary comes in with some of that stuff. But for many Christian Reformed churches, even just Lent and Advent and use of the lectionary is new. Now that then figures into this assimilation process in the denomination. And it's just fascinating watching how influence works. Because if a church, let's say, goes to weekly communion and liturgies that are in some ways harvested from Anglican and Episcopalian authors, how will that impact those churches in terms of culture war issues? And it's very complex because some of these church plants, they've tended to pull both evangelicals and people who are sort of disaffected mainliners. And then when culture war issues like same-sex marriage sort of come up, suddenly the conflict's all there in the church. So, yeah, it's a complex thing. But Mary, not talked about a lot in the Christian Reformed Church. So, there it is. John the Alcoholic. If you could sit down with Jordan Peterson, Jonathan Pageau, and John Vervaeke and yourself, what would you hope the topic would be about? How might we make this happen? Also, thanks and God bless. I guess I'm not announcing anything. So the video I released today, this commentary on this fascinating conversation between B.J. Campbell, John Robb, Patrick, I forget his name, and Jordan Hall. Somebody on Twitter right away made a comment about Pageau, and Peter Limberg in Toronto is a very interesting guy. He runs the Stoa. The Stoa is very much a part of this little corner of the internet, but hasn't, really participated so much in this space as much. And then Peter Limberg on Twitter basically said, and he sent me an email. He said, would you be interested in doing a conversation with Pageau and Peterson on this topic? Yeah. Peter Limberg was a student, or he was a student of John Vervaeke at University of Toronto, and he was a client of Jordan Peterson when he had his practice. And so Peter Limberg knows both of them fairly well, and has personal relationships with both of them that predate, and this is important, Jordan Peterson's C16 episode. So I don't know if Peterson can be brought in for something like that, basically because Peterson's schedule has to be absolutely insane given the tours that he does. But I've been quite appreciative of the fact that, unlike the first book tour, Peterson has been able to continue to bring fresh content to his channel and to seemingly do this while he tours. So his health obviously has to be holding up to a degree, and that's been a welcome change since the first book tour. So I think, oh, thank you, Rick. Oh, Anna Brigada Gomez from the Dominican Republic. Thanks for answering the question on Mary. You're welcome, Anna. I think a conversation with the four of us will happen at some point. What do I want to talk about? I want to talk about all the things we always talk about. I think Pageau is right in his time telling that modernism is receding, and that because of this, we're going to have a greater and greater opportunity to talk and think in ways that we have not been able to for decades and or centuries. I think we have to. That's sort of what's beneath that conversation at the Stoa. So I want to talk about all the things we've been talking about. And, for me, in terms of second wave conversations, the best one is still the Pageau-Peterson conversation. That was a remarkable conversation. I thought that the Four Horsemen conversation with Bishop Barron and Peterson and Pageau and Vervaeke was excellent. But one of the things that was evident there is that relationships matter and reps matter. Pageau and Vervaeke can have better conversations because they've spoken a fair amount and they're tracking with each other. That limits the amount of that helps, that potentially helps conversations get better. It also in some ways makes them more siloed, because as within the conversation, as they get more and more detailed and as they connect more, their language has to get more specific, and that limits the amount of understanding that a larger audience can have. So that's the downside of repeated conversations. And that's the downside of community. And you can see this in churches. So when in the video that I recorded last Monday in the live stream, when that former Calvinist wants to talk to me about inference superlapsarianism and limited atonement, I resist these kinds of conversations in public, partly because they limit the audience, and they also tend to corner the potential of the conversation and the potential of relationships evolving out of that conversation. So I think we would talk about God. I think we would talk about Christianity. I think we would talk about spirits and the spiritual world. I think we would talk about a lot of things. I think it would just be fun. Now, the more people you have engaged in a conversation, especially, it's really hard to have a conversation with more than 4, especially when there's a lot of high voltage going through. So I think at some point that conversation will happen. I don't know how many times it'll happen. I think if, as Peterson sort of cools off, now his YouTube channel continues to grow. I've been watching those numbers, but it's really hard to figure out how you can measure social status and impact. He's certainly not the lightning rod he was in 2018 or 2017, even though in some ways his audience was smaller then. And that's because he's just not engaging with the mainstream media like he did then. So, but I think that conversation will come at some point. It'll get put together, and I think it'll be fun. But what will come of it, I don't know, because conversations are living things. And if, most of us, as we're watching conversations now, notice that. I mean, Peugeot says, each conversation has an angel. I'd rather use the word spirit, because we can say that easily. It's the spirit of that conversation. And that word spirit then sort of does double duty. So yeah, I think it'll happen. And I'll talk about whatever the group wants to talk about, because just knowing that group and knowing what the group knows of each other, that conversation will be a whole lot of fun. So I think it'll happen. All right. I'm going to have to got a half hour. As a man who's married to a woman who is exclusively same-sex attracted, the concept of nature you've been talking about recently has been really fascinating. I'll be honest, based on my own personal conversation with my wife, I find things like the PCA report on human sexuality quite hard to agree with. And from my wife's perspective, it feels like an impossible or unfair situation to say that, in a certain sense, her orientation or desire, which she didn't ask for and hasn't been able to get away from for 25 years, is not morally neutral. What are your thoughts on this? Is it merely that it's sinful in the sense that it's missing what ought to be there? Or is it actually a sin in the way we would say dwelling on sinful lusts is a sin? How does one actually separate those desires from identity? I tend to find the Catholic views on this specifically a lot more loving to people like my wife. Wow, great question. I agree. I think I know what the PCA wants to get at, but I don't think they're doing themselves or a lot of other people any favors in working at it as they are. I think that stock in Roman Catholic theology of the body has continued to rise as this conversation has developed. My appreciation of it certainly has grown, even though I continue to have some differences. I'm still mostly comfortable. I haven't been able to improve on, I think, where the Christian Reformed Church has sort of landed itself. The 73 report, it's been nuanced again and again through subsequent reports. But for me, so I think what a lot of the traditional position tries to get at is that the ideal for human sexuality and marriage is one man and one woman. That's the ideal. Now, the difficulty we have with ideals is that we aspire to them, and that aspiration is critical. But we almost always fail them. We fail to instantiate them. Now, it's very difficult to think about, and if you listen to my last Sunday school class, I talked about this. Think about, let's say, the ideal of LeBron James as a basketball player. Was the ideal LeBron James when he was 21 or 31? Now, when LeBron James was 21, physically, that might have been his peak. But even that's difficult to say, because what you see with, let's say, NBA athletes is that as they age, they continue to work out, they continue to put on muscle. The 31-year-old LeBron might be in some ways, stronger than the 21-year-old LeBron. But in other ways, the 21-year-old LeBron is stronger than the 31-year-old LeBron. Well, in what ways is the 21-year-old stronger? Maybe he probably had more endurance. He certainly had more vitality, might have had more quickness, because might have had better balance, because all of these things tend to diminish as we age. So even a category like strength isn't easy to sort of put in a hierarchy in terms of an ideal. But the 31-year-old LeBron has a whole lot of experience the 21-year-old didn't have. He's continued to work on his shooting. He's continued to work on his passing. He's continued to work on his defense. He's continued to work on being a playmaker. It's probably true that the veteran LeBron is a better team player than the 21-year-old, because the 31-year-old has all these skills. So again, ideals are really difficult things. Now, right now in our culture, we have a problem, because we have a really thoroughgoing value of equality, which is a wonderful value, which is a Christian value. Nobody put equality into our culture more than Jesus, okay? But when it comes to ideals and equality are at opposite ends. Because equality means with the kids' soccer team, everybody gets a participation trophy. But there's probably a kid on that team that was closer to the ideal, or There are probably a variety of kids on that team that were closer to a variety of ideals than the participation trophies reflect. So my 3+ hour video on this topic is essentially boiled down to the idea that God's ideal for human marriage is one man and one woman in a lifelong committed partnership. And children would be a part of that ideal. Not every couple can have children. Not every marriage goes the distance. No marriage is as happy and life-giving as both partners would like it to be. So while we have an ideal, every marriage that we know fails it. Okay. Now, and we're comfortable with that within parameters. How far can those parameters be stretched? Can we stretch the definition of marriage to include 2 men or 2 women? Can we stretch the parameters to include 1 man and 2 women? Think of Jacob's marriage. He married 2 sisters plus 2 concubines. How does stretching these definitions impact the community as a whole? Because it's of tremendous value to a community to have a commonly subscribed to ideal, because that gives shape and form to the community and affords a culture in which people aspire to achieve the ideal. When you watch the NBA and you see a lot of people running around with 23 on their jersey, what they're saying is that in some ways, Michael Jordan embodied an ideal. And that got encoded in the number 23. Pretty cool. Michael Jordan was an amazing basketball player. He wasn't the tallest. He wasn't the strongest. He wasn't the fastest. But he was he the ideal? Well, can we imagine Michael Jordan but taller? Yeah. Can we imagine Michael Jordan but faster? Yeah. So this is where ideals are tremendously difficult for us. Now, the PCA wants to try to articulate an ideal in what they're doing. But even seeking ideals is a difficult business because they are so utterly complex. They even just trying to articulate them gets tricky. The PCA is trying to articulate that ideally men only sexually desire women. Ideally, men only sexually desire their spouse. Is that ideal? Or what about, I mean, this seeking ideals in this age is really difficult. How should churches articulate, embody, promote ideals? When you get to, so I live comfortably within the Christian Reformed Church as it is now to a degree, because of course I have gay friends, some of whom are married. And is their life improved by their marriage to the degree that I can judge? Looks that way in some cases, not all. How do I square this? Well, practically, I can say, well, there are lots of churches out there that will welcome your gay marriage and perform your gay ceremony. And so, you're no longer kept from church. No, but every church should have this policy. Oh, So what claims on an ideal are you making? And so then when I have these conversations with people in my own denomination who are, pushing this forward, I ask them, okay, you tell me what the ideal is. And they almost always beg off. And then I say, if you can't even really make some decisions about this ideal, you're really going to have trouble in your community, because people do need ideals to inspire them and to strive towards, even if they know by virtue of one thing or another, they will never personally instantiate it. Now, there again, we get to a difficult point, because that means that this is very un-American of us. This is very anti-egalitarian of us. We have to, at some point, look at ourselves and say, I have fallen short of the ideal. And you have to live with that. Now, life forces that on us at many times. I talk to a lot of people in their second marriage. Then you ask them, talk to me about your divorce. Sure hurt the kids. It broke something in one of my kids. But I'm a lot happier now, and my marriage now with my second wife is better than with my first. Life in this world is like that. And I think the Catholics, I think they've got something going in terms of their theology of the body, that at least they're trying to instantiate an ideal. So yeah. No, I'm uncomfortable with the PCA and their take. The word sin is complex. Sometimes sin is transgression, where we actively or even sometimes unintentionally cross a line. And sometimes sin is missing the mark. And there's a difference between transgression and missing the mark. Missing the mark means not being able to attain to an ideal. Transgression means actively violating a norm. And so whereas, let's say, all right, I don't think I'm revealing anything shocking to anyone. Even Jimmy Carter confessed this. Oh, here we go. Just because I am married to one woman doesn't mean that every other woman on the planet is unattractive to me. Shocking, I know. Rick just buried his head in his hands. Rick's gonna leave the church now. How could you say such a thing? Not a pleasant thing for my wife to know. It's something in a marriage that hopefully in a good marriage you can have open conversations about. And having talked to many married men, that's something that men have to watch. Men love variety in sexual partners. You can talk to the evolutionary psychologists about that. Men are visually stimulated. All of this stuff. Okay. So when Jesus talks about lust, he's basically, in some ways, there talking about mark missing and transgressing. And he's basically saying, don't let your mark missing wind up in transgression. And I think the Christian Reformed position tries to get at that nuance. Now, the big debate is same-sex attraction mark missing? That's where the debate is. Okay. I think it's less than ideal, and so I call that mark missing. Others say, no, it's simply a human variant, is being right-handed. This is an analogy that's often used. is being right-handed normative and left-handed mark missing? And I'd say, no, I don't know that it's more ideal to be right-handed than left-handed. And then the argument is, I don't know that it's more ideal to be less ideal to be same-sex attracted. But that's when I look at it, and this is where the Roman Catholic position begins to gain some traction, because I say, but all things ideal, there's a potentiality with male-female sexuality that there isn't with same-sex sexuality. And marriage, part of marriage is designed for that potentiality. And so that's, I think, a difference. So yeah, that's where I stand. So anybody concerned about PVK going to synod and wondering what he thinks about human sexuality, I mean, I think I've talked to plenty on my channel about it. But at the same time, again, the church has to give affordance to people who can't reach the ideal. And that's all of us. And how do we instantiate that? There's the conversation right in there. So that's my take. All right, I'll keep going. I'll try and finish these up today. If reality is fractal in nature, if a person can be possessed by a demon, then a family can be possessed by a demon. How would one go about exorcising his family's demon egregore? Okay. You got to be a little careful with language here. When B.J. Campbell is talking about an egregore, he is talking about basically an emergent spirit from a community of people that manifests itself in communities of people through time. Generally speaking, when we, in a Christian context, say the word demon, at least in the modern era, we tend to think about a spiritual entity that, I gotta mute my watch here because it's buzzing at me. We tend to think about something very different from what B.J. Campbell talks about as an egregore. And obviously part of what I've been trying to do when I talk about school spirit, which is closer to an egregore than what we often think about when we read demon in the Bible, is try and somehow bring some continuity between those two worlds. When we meet someone like Legion in the Gospels, and we see something like possession, where it seems that, oh gosh, this gets so complicated. This spirit has completely possessed. That's what we mean by possession. If I possess this puppet, it means I have it and Rick doesn't. I'm possessing it. So demon possession is basically that spirit is so completely controlling that human being that there is actually underneath there another human being that is imprisoned. And what Jesus does with Legion is exorcises that demon from that person, and the person emerges out again. Part of what happened in the Pentecostal movements of the 80s and 90s was a new language came in, which talked about demonic oppression. And in Pentecostal circles, someone who was being oppressed was someone who was being bothered by a spirit. And what's interesting in those communities, you can see some of the same things happening as we see right now going on in this little corner of the internet when we're trying to fill in the space between school spirit and legion. I'm being oppressed by the spirit of smoking. And if you go back to my conversation with Peugeot about angels and demons and the city of God, you know, Peugeot uses, even in a clip that's on Peugeot's clip channel, let's say someone who is being oppressed by the spirit of alcoholism. Now, part of the reason I have called Jordan Peterson the unauthorized exorcist is because the dramatic change that he happened in a lot of individuals' lives was in some ways akin to an exorcism. That certain egregores and certain spirits people were released from the power of those things. Not only can families be impacted by spirits, but so can cities and nations and even ages. Spirits go all the way up like that. You might say, well, what are we talking about? And then you want to get into ontology, and then we have to deal with Cartesian dualism, yada, yada, yada. Let's cut through some of that and basically say, in some ways, using this worldview and framework might be better, more helpful than not having it available to us. And this is exactly what B.J. Campbell and some of those on that Stoa conversation were saying, that this sort of Cartesian dualism, this way of using language that is deep within modernism, doesn't help us understand why everyone recognizing the injustice of Russia invading Ukraine might become something that leads us to places we don't want to go. So there is a spectrum of agency between school spirit and legion. Jordan Peterson seemed to exercise people who were suffering from nihilism-induced depression by watching videos of him talk about lab rats and psychology and all of that. Wasn't that interesting? That you can exercise a whole generation of people who have been oppressed by the spirit of nihilism. Wow. Once you give yourself to this understanding and this language, you can see how useful it is in terms of talking about whole ranges of things. So exercising a family, that'll have a lot to do with its principality, and it will have a lot to do with the spiritual ways that are maintaining the oppression. Someone who's an alcoholic, they go to AA. The meeting is a very spiritually powerful thing. Any alcoholic who has found success in AA will attest to that. In fact, I've known many who have said, I find that meeting more spiritually powerful than a church service. But that's not all the spiritual work that's going to be going on. People who have to unlearn some habits discover that sacramentalism is all over the place, and they're going to need to they might have that little coin that marks anniversaries in sobriety, and when they feel tempted, they might feel that coin in their pocket, and suddenly their sobriety takes on matter. It might mean new relationships with your wife. It might mean shopping at a new store. It might mean calling your sponsor when you start feeling regretful or resentful rather than grabbing the bottle. So part of why we like using a particularly simple ontology is it gives us hope that, well, maybe I can just with some ceremony fix this up. Well, sometimes, maybe it happens, most of the time not. And that's why, to go all the way back to the first question today, the second question, discipleship. When you become a friend of Bill, when you go to AA, you in a sense become a disciple of Bill. And you become, and again, every person that I know that's been steeped in AA has all these little sayings, and they know what the big book is, and you fake it till you make it, and you work the serenity prayer, and you have all of these things. And this is all dealing with demons in their life. And see, I can use the word that way and you all understand it perfectly. So a family might need exorcism that doesn't involve anything that you might associate with the movie The Exorcist. But that exorcism might involve, well, maybe now they're going to start praying before meals. And they're going to stop engaging in patterns that have been destructive for the family, that perhaps brings into the family a spirit of anger or reactivity. Maybe they're going to start going to church, and maybe their exorcism is going to take 20 years. Also, any thoughts or commentary on your Break the Rules podcast experience? Reps matter, and having a conversation with 4 perfect strangers is not ideal. Part of the reason when I do a randos conversation, that I want to spend real time on biography is because it helps us get to know each other. And so at some point when in the conversation, the former Calvinist wanted to talk about a whole bunch of particulars about Calvin doctrine, I felt myself ramping up in some ways and say, okay, well, let me stop fighting straw men and let me start seeing this individual. And the best way for me to see him is through his story. And so then when he and I started asking him questions, personal questions about his story, and he was starting to answer, we started to get into that pattern. The show stopped it. And I can understand why they would stop it. It's not that kind of show. So then I had to kind of adjust, and thank you, Croydon Kicks. This exorcism talk was very helpful. Thank you. Part of the reason I had to adjust and go into a different mode to hopefully have some productive engagement. So that's one of the things that I took away, is that I like what I do. And for example, the reason Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke can make progress together is because they know each other. And the reason Jonathan Peugeot and John Vervaeke can make progress together is because they're getting the reps in. And taking 4 perfect strangers and hoping that they will have conversations with each other that are productive is sort of a long shot. And so when Jordan Peterson does his dialogues, as he calls them, on his channel, he's usually read the book. And so then he at least has some place to start. But, the conversation that came out this week, I think it was Robert Greene and the things of power, that kind of stuff. I was quite interested in that, but the conversation with Peterson, I didn't find to be very good at all. Jordan, as he knows he sometimes does, did too much talking. I would have liked to have heard more from Greene. Then I went and listened to a Chris Williamson interview with Greene, and I've listened to a few other things, and I'm still thinking about that. And so I was happy for the introduction to Greene, but the conversation itself didn't go very well. And so, we don't often appreciate just how difficult this is to do well. And so I think, I want to see more conversations between Peterson and Vervaeke and Peugeot, because the more they talk, the better they know each other, the better those conversations will become, the more satisfying. Now, again, status hierarchies bind and blind. Peterson is now internationally famous. Everybody wants to talk to him, yada, yada, yada. He's a lot less available than Vervaeke or Peugeot. Vervaeke and Peugeot are a lot less available than they used to be. Even I'm less available than I used to be. And I consider that a shame. And that, again, is partly why small and local are beautiful. So, all right, I'm going to end this. End of questions for March 25. First comment. Ooh, I've been getting a lot out of the videos you've been doing around narrative lately. Where do you see that fitting into the greater thing and the conversation? Where do you see that fitting in to the greater thing and the conversations your commentaries and conversations have been circling around? Also really digging the sermon series on John. Thanks. Well, the videos that I've been doing on Critical Drinker, on movie making, U-shaped structure, some of these, we tend to segment that out and see that as a separate thing from a lot of the rest of life. But narrative is the operating system that human beings currently run on and have for a very long time. One definition of me has fingerprints and breath and skin and more hair on my chin than on my head. Another definition of me is a story that has been running since the middle 60s in my head. Another definition of me is the story that is me, that is in my mother's head since she gave birth to me. Another definition of me is in my sister's head. Another definition of me is in my wife's head. Another is in my children's memories. Another is in photographs. How can all of these things come together? Narrative is the best tool. That's what I mean by compression engine. The best tool we have for bringing all of this together. It's therefore not a surprise that the Bible works as a narrative. Now, the Bible's relationship with narrative is complex. Starts in Genesis, ends in Revelation. There's a ton of poetry. There's some law. There's some numbers. There's a lot in that library. But we as human beings find narrative to be, for the most part, the most productive way we can engage with a world too big for us to see and get in our noggins. So shapes of narrative, this is why I've been thinking a lot about this. 1,500 years ago, if you lived in a little village in what today would be called France, the majority of sense making would be done by your church and the stories that you grew up with and lived within, even if you never traveled more than a few miles from the place you were born. We are today bombarded with stories. Hollywood is the most successful church on the planet today. Church, which has a degree of continuity to that sense maker back to the French village 1,500 years ago, is in some ways really struggling, but not out of the game. So I wish that whatever vehicle is at the stoplight that has that deep bass, I can't tell you how many videos I have to pause just because of that thing. You want to go out there and yell at him, Rick? But take your motorcycle out there and drive some circles around him and say, stop, turn that thing down. You're messing up your hearing. Oh, the light changed. He went away. Okay. It's almost always a he. Narrative is a big part of the whole sense making. And so what my videos, I tend to be an integrator. I'm trying to integrate lots of things. And that's why my channel and my videos are so eclectic sometimes. But narrative is integral to sense making. And part of Vervaeke's pushback on narrative is, well-founded. But it's sort of like saying, the English language has its problems. I'm going to stop using it. All right, well, maybe you got Spanish or German or French or Esperanto, but it's going to be English just because it's all over the place. I think Android has its problems. You got Android and iOS. You might find something that's running Tizen or some other attempt at a smartphone operating system, but it's going to be Android and Android or iOS. It's going to be Mac or Windows or Linux. We're not going to get away from narrative anytime soon. And now Vervaeke is right in noting, there's a lot of BSing going on with narrative. Absolutely. And so, when I brought in John Stewart into the conversation this week, I did so with fear and trembling because I know how politically reactive some of you are. And how frustrated some of you are at my failure to align with the politics that you think I should. And that's fine. But I brought in John Stewart because I wanted someone from the left who is at least making some lip service to sense making. And this business about facts and narrative is a complex business, and we have to get better at it. And sometimes we can learn to get better at narrative itself when we're paying attention to movies than when we're paying attention to news, because movies is a little bit out there, even though in some ways it's much more to the core, because these deep narratives that we use to interpret everything are in some ways governing us, and the relationship between them and, if we want to use egregores or spirits or principalities and powers, none of that is incidental. And so in kind of being all over the map with a bunch of these things, I want to bring them together, and I want us to see some of the relationships, to see that, for example, if you're talking about John Wayne, there's a reason you put his name on the book. And we should think hard about why people's religion and their politics are so much like this. And we should probably be a little bit kinder with them, because I believe all of our religion and our politics are sort of like this, even if we should loosen them up a little bit so we can learn to love our political enemies. So that's where that fits in. Clarification on the earlier question. What we see in Christendom is a lot of worldly nominalism that the church and many pastors even seem to be actively complicit in. What should we do? Thank you. I didn't quite know. I mean, especially the part of the question that went, just be real with that fall trajectory for once, Paul. So there's always the antithetical. And if you read the first epistle of John, it's deeply antithetical. You know what? True motorcycle riders ride Harleys. Rick be anathema. Now he's really going to leave the church. We have to, you cannot. So I want to, again, the video I might make this afternoon, I might treat a Doug Wilson video that I thought was absolutely brilliant. I thought it was brilliant. I don't agree with it, but I thought it was brilliant. The antithesis is real. There's right or wrong. And there's pervasive nominalism in Christendom. But part of the reason the nominalism is in there is because our grasp on the categories are insufficient. Nominalism is okay, I'll go back to the NBA. Have you ever watched an NBA player double dribble or walk? They do it all the time. And every now and then when they get called on it, everyone's in shock. But if you're really watching the game closely, NBA players are walking and double dribbling all the time. That's kind of like nominalism in Christianity. And it's because we don't have a grasp on the categories and the real relations. And so they get slippery. And so, there's a lot of people whose taste in Reformed ministers would be much more like Doug Wilson. Here are the categories. Here are the good apples, the bad apples. Here are the good characters and the bad characters. And everything is cut and dried, and everything is right and wrong, and everything is dogmatic. I actually have a lot of respect for that. But I don't necessarily see them, number one, really always able to live up to it, and not always able to practice what they preach. And the video that he did on Apologies That Lie, I thought was full of nuance and really good. But when it gets right down to it, applying it, we're really bad. So Elisha and Jeremiah, yeah, well, how about Samuel? Taking up a sword and not finishing the genocide that Saul squirmed out of because he wanted to keep the goods of the Amorites. There's a place for the antithetical, right and wrong, good and bad, black and white, absolutely. And then there's also a place for the sinful woman that Jesus says loved much. And only God really seems to be able to get that right. And Jesus, nobody can be more antithetical than Jesus, and nobody can be more gracious than Jesus. And those are these diverse excellencies that Jonathan Edwards pointed out. That nobody warns against sin stronger than Jesus. And nobody is more gracious to sinners than Jesus. And you say, how can one person embody that ideal? That's why we can't quite process him. And that's why he continues to be fresh and interesting. And that's why the Gospels continue to be read with profit. So, yeah, there are Elijahs and Jeremiahs out there. And I've seen some of them do amazing things, and I've seen some of them crash and burn. End of questions. So that's it for today. Thank you all for joining us. I hope this was of some benefit. Rick, did you keep a, yeah, you probably have an audio copy of this. So don't turn the computer off when you're done. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me. I hope it was beneficial for you. And yeah, I hope good things have happened today. So you can end transmission, Rick.